Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm not going to really do a backgrounder on Mr. Jerry Davis. He can introduce himself. You'll find out. I wanted to just tell you why I invited him here. A couple of reasons, and then a little of our history. So you guys know, or maybe some of you don't know, I grew up in Cupertino. I don't currently live here, but I was from age 5 till when I went away to college. And in that period of time, and it was kind of a joke where I used to work at NASA, I had no idea there was a NASA center 20 minutes that way. So part of my thing is, first of all, if people don't know there's a NASA center in the Bay Area, you now know. And secondly, we have such a STEM-focused environment in our community, and our schools are so great. You know, NASA's always looking for that next generation of space explorers, so I'm just here to stimulate the learning and confirm my philosophy of continuous learning and kind of create a different environment and a different perspective within Cupertino. It's such a great city. We should be talking to all of our different partners and everybody to be speaking. So I was just talking with this nice lady here. We have a program that is this whole year, the NASA Speaker Series, and once we lock down one more with a date, I'll be able to publish the whole thing so you can see the dates and times of all of those talks in the coming year. So I thank Jerry for kicking this series off. So a little bit about Jerry and I. Jerry and I used to work at NASA together. He was the Chief Information Officer at NASA Ames, and I was something called the Associate Center Director. No one will know what that means. It just means the city manager for Ames Research Center, as it turns out, right? I didn't know that. And so through that time, I got to know him really well. And one time he was asked by our I don't forget what it stands for, African American Advisory Group, our affinity group, to do a talk. And it was probably one of the most compelling talks I've ever seen. I've invited him to do it again, and I've encouraged him to, kind of pull it together in a similar way that he did it the first time. And I'm hoping that you will find it just as compelling as I did. So, but a couple of logistics as well. Afterwards, Jerry is going to talk for the first 45 minutes to an hour. You'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. He is a cybersecurity professional, so there's lots of questions about his professional expertise. I invite people to come up to the mic here to ask him those questions. I'm so happy to see a lot of students here. Definitely time for that as well. So the coordination with the schools turned out. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Jerry Davis.
Thanks, Deb. Such good looking folks. Definitely appreciate it. As Deb said, Jerry Davis, and again, we worked together over at NASA Ames. NASA Ames was actually my second time through NASA. I spent a total of about 10 years with NASA altogether. Started out my first time through NASA at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I was a Chief Information Security Officer there, responsible for cybersecurity and information protection for NASA-wide, including all the spaceborne assets, ground assets, and that's when the shuttle was still flying at that time, so responsible for all those systems that connect to the shuttle and for the purpose of ensuring that cyber didn't impact safety to the missions and to astronauts and things of that nature. Very challenging job, very fulfilling job. I left at some point, went to another agency. A few years later, NASA called me and said, hey, do you want to come back and go out to Silicon Valley and be the Chief Information Officer out at Ames Research Center? I grew up in Southern California. I hadn't been home in the area for quite a while. I moved out to Washington, D.C. and spent about 20 years there, and then came back to Ames in 2013, where again, I was the Chief Information Officer and still stayed quite a bit involved in cybersecurity for NASA, and then did some work, a little bit of work at the national level and working on different programs nationally in the cybersecurity arena. As Deb said, this particular talk I did for the first time, I believe it was 2017, and it was around Martin Luther King birthday, and I was asked by the AAAG she mentioned earlier to do a talk. I had no idea what I was gonna do it on, and so I came up with an idea. Just really, it's about me. It's about my path of where I've been and where I've come from and kind of where I am today and how I got there and things that influenced me to help me get to where I am. We just celebrated, hopefully most of you just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday a couple of days ago. And, he was a absolute, phenomenal individual. Everything from a Nobel Peace Prize to a doctorate and civil rights leader, and had a really profound effect on my life as a kid. Didn't really know much about Dr. King really as a kid until I got a little older, but he had a profound effect on my life. I've had, from a professional career perspective, an amazing career. Just a fascinating, amazing career. It's not often that you get to live your dreams. And one of my dreams had been to work at NASA. One of my dreams had also been to work at Central Intelligence Agency, when I had an opportunity to do that. The interesting thing about all of this is that in living my dream, the statistics say, from where I come from, and my background in my life, is I shouldn't even be here. Statistically speaking, again, from my background and the environment that I grew up in, I was supposed to either be dead or incarcerated by the time I was probably 22 years old or something like that. And somehow, through a number of good graces and growing up in a really strong family with my grandmother in particular, and we'll talk about that, and some of the principles that she believed, it helped me get through what I call the life as an existential threat. And what I mean by that is that there were so many things in my life that should have derailed me and had me go way off track. And as I said, I should either be probably in jail somewhere or dead or strung out on drugs, again, given the background, but managed to get through all of that. So let's just talk about a little bit sort of my background and on the family side when I was a lot younger. That's me and my three brothers. Above there, that's Martin Luther King Jr. Center. I'm from South Bend, Indiana. And if any of you have heard South Bend, Indiana in the news of late, that's where Mayor Pete Buttigieg is from. Same city, same exact place. This picture at the bottom, that's me. I'm the real handsome one in the middle, little guy in the middle. As you're facing the picture to the right, that's my middle brother, Dwayne. He's about a year older than me. And then a taller guy, that's my oldest brother, Michael. I say humble beginnings because humble is just another way of saying poor, when you live in this environment. But it's kind of funny when you're poor and everybody around you are poor, you don't realize that you're poor, right? You don't understand it at all. You have no concept of it. But as kids, we grew up, we were probably about, South Bend is probably, 20, 30 miles or so from Gary, Indiana. And this is at the same time, there's a real famous family from Gary, Indiana, right? The Jacksons, right? Michael Jackson, the Jacksons 5. And so that picture that was taken there, that was around Easter, probably about 1973, 74, something like that. And I remember because the Jacksons was such a big family in the music industry, we thought that we could be like the Jackson 5 and start our own singing group and that sort of thing. And so we would wear these suits all the time that we got for Easter and try to sing. And we thought we'd have a recording album one day. Well, you see how that turned out. Didn't turn out so great. But the effect of Martin Luther King or Dr. King on my life, it really started with that center that you see in the picture above. And that was a center it was a community center that was set up in South Bend. It's still there. That really kept us out of harm's way, kept us out of trouble. They gave you activities to do and things to do in the afternoons in the summer. But one of the big things that it did was, in the summer times, it fed you. Low-income kids and low-income families, you could go there and you can eat during breakfast and lunch they would serve every day during the summer. And I can remember being a little kid, and in the mornings there was this bell that would ring, and all the kids would come running out of the houses. We're running down the alley to go and get this free lunch or this free breakfast. And then you could stay there all day and you play tennis and play basketball, and it really just kept you off the streets. And then you do the same thing around lunch. And in the evening times, you're usually home with your families. When I was about 5 years old, my mother left South Bend and moved to Southern California. It was her feeling that her children were not going to survive in South Bend, Indiana, if she stayed there. So she moved here to California to make things better for us. My mother, by the time she was 19 years old, already had 3 boys. And my cousin, I got a cousin who's about a year younger than me that lived with us as well. So it was really kind of 4 of us. So my mom had moved away, and we stayed with the matriarch of the family, which was my grandmother. Her name is Bernice, but we called her Nita. And she was very, very strong-willed, strong hand, and very much kept us in line and in order. We were latchkey kids. She worked 3 jobs during the day, 2 or 3 jobs. She was a cook. She was on her feet all the time. But just a phenomenal lady. She didn't tolerate a lot of nonsense, and she couldn't, because we were just, 4 kids kind of living in a house. We were like home alone on ourselves all the time. And so she didn't tolerate a lot of nonsense. One of her favorite sayings was always, if you don't do what I say, if you don't come in and do what I tell you to do, I'll beat the black off of you. That was one of her favorite things. And I used to be a lot darker back in those days. So I'm kind of just, tan color now. But my grandmother was really just a real phenomenal person. Just a phenomenal lady that went through a lot, but did all she could to make sure that we were never hungry, that we had clothes on our backs. And it was things that you didn't really realize until much later in life. We had grown up, started off in the projects, in the ghettos, and she had rented a house for a number of years. And my grandmother's, one of the big things in her life, and working all these years, multiple jobs, was to one day own her own home. And so she worked and worked and worked. And my grandmother was always kind of in ill health, but she fought through it. And she worked, and she did it largely for the kids. She always wanted us to have our own bedrooms and a home that we can come home to and really call our own home. We slept in our bedroom. I remember there was 2 beds, and me and one brother slept in one bed, and my other brother and cousin slept in another bed, and we're all kind of squished up. And that's just kind of how life was. My dad was around, kind of in and out of my life, and his mother, my other grandmother, they lived on the other side of town. So we had a lot of contact, but we largely stayed with my grandmother, Grandma Nita, and she worked all day, every day, for years. And we spent a lot of times at home in the evening. Latchkey kids, we would run home, and there would always be a note on the table, and it would say, dinner would be there, and it'd say, be inside the house by the time the street lights came on, and we would do that. And then finally one day, my grandmother told us that she bought a house. And it was the most, I remember still, and I was probably about 6 years old or so, just the excitement of we finally own our own home. And the interesting thing is that there was a little contention between my grandmother and my dad's side of the family. South Bend at that time was still very segregated. And in the community where my grandmother had bought the house was in a predominantly white neighborhood. And so the folks on my dad's side of the family were saying, you probably really shouldn't buy a house over there, you shouldn't live in that neighborhood. There's no people like us, there's no black people over there. It's fairly segregated. But my grandmother wanted a better place for us to live. So she got this house, and I remember like it was yesterday. I remember moving everything into the house and running through it and seeing the bedrooms, and seeing how happy my grandmother was and my brothers. And we had it was just such a joyous day that day. It was phenomenal. And, after we got everything moved in, everything's in the house, my grandmother decided, she says, hey, I want to go out and I'm going to go grocery shopping. and we're going to have our first meal there in the house. And ultimately, she decided that we would all go with her. And so we did. We piled into the car, and we took off, and we went grocery shopping. And I remember as we were coming back home and we were going down the street, I remember almost again, I like it was yesterday. And the thing is that because of the color of our skins, the people elected to burn the house down. And I can still remember it like yesterday. I can still smell it. When I think about it, I can still smell it. I remember looking at the look on my grandmother's face. And at that point, I had never seen my grandmother cry, ever. Never seen my grandmother cry. And I remember walking up in the fire department where they were just standing there, said there was nothing they can do. The house was a total loss. I can still remember the flames coming out of the roof of the house, and the house was largely just charred embers. And they let us at some point walk up into the entranceway of the house. And I remember seeing just a big hole in the floor, and still can smell that smell of the burn. And it's interesting in that it had such a profound effect on me that it's not that if I smell any kind of, let's say, a wood burning, it's very specific. I can very specifically remember that particular smell of that house burning. And I still remember the look on my grandmother's face and the tears coming down her face. And my grandmother never was able to get a home since then. And it had a profound effect on me for years. I was definitely afraid of house fires. Definitely afraid of house fires for years and years and years. And every time I would come home, even when I was older, I'd drive around the corner, I would always imagine the house being on fire. And I would walk to the house and unplug, even though this fire was set deliberately. I would walk through my house for years and I would unplug things when I would leave for the day or leave for a couple of hours, because I was always afraid that I was going to come home and there was going to be just this huge fire. And my grandmother, the type of person that she was, she never let us hold anger for that. And I remember my grandmother very clearly telling me and my brothers that we'd have to forgive people for doing that. We'd have to forgive. And I always felt for years that my grandmother had every right to be angry. She had every right to be, some of a racist and that sort of thing against another group of people. But my grandmother would say, it's not everybody. You basically can't put everybody in the same bucket. There's just a few ignorant people. But she's not going to let us. She says you have to forgive people, and she was a big believer and a big follower, and she would always talk about Dr. King, and that was one of the principles that I've kind of lived behind, is about forgiveness. And when he says we must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive, these are things that I've taken with me, and everywhere that I've worked is about this attitude of forgiveness. And my grandmother held that very, very near and dear for years. And I was always angry about that she wouldn't, be more angry. She wouldn't let us be angry first people, and she wouldn't, that she would forgive everybody about that, even though she never again owned a home ever again in her entire life. I thought she had worked very hard for this. At this point, we had moved around. I lived with my other grandmother for a while. We lived in some different places. We were able to slowly kind of get back on your feet. And at this point, I'm at the point where I'm probably about 10 years old or so, and it was about time they were going to reunite us with my mother. My mother is in California. And so my mother had set up a home for us in Southern California and had sent for us. And I remember it very, very clearly, leaving South Bend in the middle of the night. One of my aunt's good friends picked us up and drove us into Illinois, where I stayed with my great-grandparents for a few hours. And then a great uncle came and took us to O'Hare Airport. And that was the first time I had ever gotten on an airplane. But it was in the middle of the night, and they did that because my mother and everybody was afraid that if my father found out, that he would stop things and keep us there in South Bend. And so just like a good spy novel, we were spirited out of South Bend in the middle of the night, and several hours later in California. My oldest brother, Michael, he was, we were all close to my grandmother, but he was extremely close to my grandmother, so he decided to stay. He didn't want to leave my grandmother. And so he decided to stay with her. She had moved to Illinois at that point, and he decided that he was going to stay with her for a little while. And eventually he joined about a year and a half later in California. My grandmother, we could never get her to move. She would not leave Illinois. That's where her parents were. That's kind of where she grew up, and she decided to stay there, but we always stayed in very, very close touch. Things were great. 1978, I moved to Southern California. I go to a private school. My mom's doing really well. And she gets married to another gentleman. And things were going really, really well. They were both educators, and life was good. But it didn't stay good for long. It started getting really, really tough. My mom and her husband at the time wanted to start their own private school, kind of like a charter school, and put everything they had into this. But it just wasn't getting off the ground. And so things started to degrade very, very rapidly. And it degraded to the point where we simply just didn't have any food in the house. There was no food in the house. Electricity's getting shut off. Electricity's getting shut on. Water's getting shut off. Water's getting shut on if we had a couple dollars to pay on bills and that sort of thing. And I remember that it was a picture like this that I saw. I remember looking in the refrigerator one day, and it was completely empty. And I want to tell you something about hunger. Hunger is a very motivating force. It was an extremely motivating force. And I remember like that deep, you ever get that deep hunger feeling? You know, imagine that for a handful of days where you're just so hungry, you don't know what to do. And my mom always tried to do something. One of the big things she would do is when she got a couple of dollars, she would buy a lot of pinto beans and flour tortilla shells. And I ate probably, more bean burritos than you could shake a stick at. She would make them, and then she would put them in the freezer. And it got to the point where we just didn't have money even for food anymore. So one of the things we did was up the street, there was a Safeway store. And we figured out that at certain times during the week, they would throw out certain foods, particularly in the bakery, they would throw out a lot of the baked goods. And so we would go into the dumpster behind the store and take all the old baked stuff out and take it back to the house. And then my mom, if the electricity was on, she would throw it in the freezer, particularly the bread and that sort of thing. And then we would eat that over time. So it'd be me and my brother and my mom's husband at the time. We'd go back behind the store and we'd take all this food out of the dumpsters. And one day we were back there and we're coming out of the dumpster, and the guy, he had the big rack of breads, and he threw it in and he went back in. Well, he was coming back out with another rack. And I remember looking out and we're seeing this guy, and we just thought, okay, the gig's up. We're going to get in trouble. We're going to jail or whatever. And I still, it's one of these things where I remember this gentleman's face, this white guy, I remember his face. And I remember him looking at us with just disbelief in his face as we're like coming out of these trash cans, out of the dumpsters. And he says, what are you doing? And I remember my mom's husband saying, look, we don't have any food. We've been coming here for a couple of weeks, and we've been taking, the things that you're throwing away. And I'll never forget the guy. He says, you don't have to do that. He says, you know what? He says, I'll tell you, I'll let you know when I'm going to bring this out, and you meet me, and I'll bring it out and I'll help you put it in the car. And this guy could have lost his job over this. And I remember him doing that. He started doing it every week, and then he started bringing meats out and that sort of thing. And the guy had phenomenal compassion. And that's one of the things also when he talks about an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individual concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Was something, again, that really resonated with me about the compassion that this guy, that he had for us, for people he didn't even know. 3 little black kids climbing out of a dumpster. And he put his job on the line to not just bring out day old food, or day old bakeries, but started bringing out meats and that sort of thing. Eventually, things got worse, right? So we're in a house and we can no longer stay in the house, and they've taken the cars and that sort of thing. At this point, I'm homeschooled. We had been homeschooled for a number of years. They came and they took the car. They powered down the electricity permanently. The sheriff's department came and said, you got to vacate the home. The bank wants you out. And we took everything that we had and we put it in a U-Haul and took it to a storage unit. And my mom's husband was some kind of a negotiator, and he negotiated with the guy at the storage unit to store all of our goods and that sort of thing until he was able to pay him. And we left. We left that house. And where we went next was we went to a place called in Southern California called Prado Regional Park. And that's a picture up above up there. And we went to Prado Park and we basically pitched a tent. Me and my two brothers stayed in the tent, had a big hole in the side, I'll never forget, and the wind would whip through. And my mom and her husband, and he had a daughter that was the same age as me. They had a little camper that they had borrowed from a friend, a little fifth wheel that they pulled in, and it was pretty old, and they stayed in there. And I remember just laying there at night and wondering, where's the next bill going to come from? What are we going to do? What's to become of me? But I never, ever really lost, my way and hope. And doing that, I learned over time about having humility. Now, this jumps ahead years and years and years. That one of the things that I did is, that's my left forearm that you see down there, and that's a tattoo that I got. And it just says, forget not, and then it has this longitude, latitude numbers on there, the gateway to humility. And those numbers that you see there, if you were to put them into Google Earth, what they'll do is they'll take you right to where that blue pin is. It says the gateway to humility. That's the entrance to the park. And then what I did was I have a picture, that same exact picture, and I would take it everywhere I went in my career and I would hang it up. And it always remind me of remember where I came from and always be a humble person and always have humility and have humility towards others and not to just walk by people and people, you never know people's situations and that sort of thing. And I've always kept those, deep within myself. I also carry it, for me, I'm very much a people person. I always say that, my profession is around cybersecurity and information technology, but my real passion is around people. And so I wear it on my sleeve sometimes, but I try to be extremely humble and try to have a lot of humility. The words that Dr. King says that we must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And so I always try to do that. I always try to learn through that. And we stayed in that park probably for a couple of weeks. And interesting enough, my mother and her husband, they were very much involved in the church. They were very tied to a church. And the interesting thing that had an effect on me was that, no one came out there to help us. My mom had one really good friend that came out and would bring some food and that sort of thing. It was almost like we were a pariah at that point. We had to come on hard times and we kind of got shoved off to the side. We eventually left that park, went to my mom's friend's house, and we slept in her driveway. So me and my brothers moved into the little fifth wheel camper that sat in her driveway, and my mom and her husband moved into her garage. And at that point, we worked to try to get back on our feet. Now, mind you, my mother's husband was a bright guy. Had a PhD in psycholinguistics, went to Berkeley, and did graduate school down in the Pomona colleges. So he was a bright guy. His thing was he didn't want to work for anybody. And so he would rather starve and be homeless than work for anybody. Well, he achieved that goal. We got very hungry and we were very homeless. But eventually, they came up with a plan. And they started working again and started meeting people. And we were able to eventually move out of that park and move into a home sometime later. As you leap forward a number of years, I've made my way into the Marine Corps, and I'm kind of like, I like to tell people, I'm kind of like the Black Forrest Gump. I said, I'm always just kind of like falling into things. I ended up going into the Marine Corps Reserves because I felt, at the time that when I went in, that it would give me something that I could fall back on. Because I'll tell you, again, being hungry, it was something I never wanted to experience again. Being homeless is something I never wanted to experience again. So I figured if I went into the Marine Corps, particularly in the reserves, I could learn something. I was in and out I worked all the time. I was in and out of college. I was going to community college down in Southern California. And eventually I made my way. And at the time, I was a huge fan of the Central Intelligence Agency. I wanted to be in the intelligence community. I had gone to the Gulf War, was decorated combat Marine. I come back and I make my way. I change jobs in the Marine Corps and I go into the counterintelligence field. And I applied to the Central Intelligence Agency. They recruited me out of Southern California. And I made my way into Central Intelligence Agency. That document on the left is actually my offer letter with my badge from 1994, when I was making a grand total of something like $26,000. And I packed up Southern California and they moved me to Northern Virginia. And I remember going into my first day at Central Intelligence Agency, and when you go into the main headquarters building, there's a huge seal of Central Intelligence Agency on the floor. And I remember standing in the seal, and I remember crying because, again, I wasn't supposed to be there. CIA hires less than 1% of the people that apply to that environment. The process was grueling. I went through 8 hours of polygraph, 2 years of background investigation. They used to go see a psychologist, they used to see a psychiatrist. They couldn't believe that I had never done drugs, growing up in Southern California, some of the harsh environments I had. They never believed I hadn't stolen anything, that I hadn't killed somebody. And I made my way in there, and I remember standing on their great seal and, in an oversized suit because I didn't have money for a good suit, and just kind of tears rolling down my face because I couldn't believe that I was there. It was just so surreal to me. And I made my way. I remember going through the main hall. You make a left when you come into the main doors, and you go through the guard station. You take a left, and all the directors. There's oil paintings of all the directors of Central Intelligence Agency. And I had been a real intelligence buff, so I knew everything that was going on around the intelligence community in terms of directors and operations and that sort of thing. And I remember just one by one, just looking at all the directors. And I went to the library. And there's a famous CIA officer that worked there. That he was gone by the time I got there, but his name was James Jesus Angleton, and he was known for doing counterintelligence work and finding spies and that sort of thing. And kind of very, very interesting individual. And I remember going and finding his old office and walking around, and just couldn't believe that I was there. But the thing is, several years later, so now you fast forward almost 10 years later. And NASA calls and says, hey, do you want to be the Chief Information Security Officer at NASA? Now, people ask me all the time, they're like, well, how did you get into NASA? I always say it's easy, I applied. The job came open, I put in an application, and they hired me. I don't know what they were thinking, but they hired me. The interesting thing about that is that in 2003, so this is 2007, in 2003, I applied to the astronaut program. And I didn't make it, obviously. But NASA came back and said, I guess 4 years later, they said, as a consolation prize, I'd like to run cybersecurity for all of NASA. I said, yeah, I can do that. That sounds like something that would be fun to do. But the thing is that in these things in life that are supposed to tear you down or potentially make your dreams and everything that you care about and your passions go away, I always maintain a level of hope. Always maintain a level of hope. Even when I was a little kid living in Indiana, I had no context of anything outside of South Bend or outside our environment, but I always knew there was something different. There was always something else there. I just knew it innately. I don't know what that is. I don't know what you call it. But I never lost hope for these things. And my grandmother would never let you lose hope for that. My grandma used to say all the time, she used to say, you can be the doctor or a lawyer, Indian chief. She's like, she goes, but you better not ever be a thief. She used to always say, don't ever be a thief. And she goes, one thing, she goes, I can't stand a thief and I can't stand a liar. And it was so, I always felt like I fulfilled her dreams by making it to CIA, by making it to NASA at a time, when I was at CIA, nobody, in the family really knew what I did, right? I told them I did risk management, and I was flying all over the world. Now, all of this is, I'm not even 30 years old yet. I'm 27 or something like that at this point. When I got to NASA, I was already a senior executive in the government. Was a senior executive at about 36 years old, and when I made my way to NASA, and I was, my grandmother was so proud of me when I made it to NASA, and I was telling her about it, and she would always say, "Oh, do you have to go up on the space shuttle?" And I'm like, "No, well, maybe one day I'll have to go up and fix something, and I really thought that was the things that made her most proud about me and my brothers that went on to do things in their own level of successes, however they defined it. But I always kept that hope. And as it says, we must accept finite disappointment, but never lose infinite hope. And I never did. And these, again, are some of the things that kept me moving forward and getting to the positions, whether it was at NASA or other places, and where I am today is by kind of having these characteristics and these traits and these attributes that I never let go of. Towards the end there, this was a big thing that I found overall was really about love. Love for family and friends and people, and really the things that really moved me forward. You can see, our Michael Jackson get up there at the top. Those are me and my brothers. The picture's a little old, but they look pretty much the same. I'm still the best looking one out of the group. I'm in the very middle there. Michael, the one with the big afro, he's on the right this time, and Dwayne, my middle brother, he's on the left there. The beautiful lady kissed me on the cheek is my mother. That was at my wedding in 1995 when I was married. And at the bottom there to the left of me is my grandmother, Nita. She passed away a number of years ago, back in 2009. That's the only picture that I have with her and I. The picture that when you walked in that you saw of me when I was a little kid, was up on the screen. It's one of the only ones I have because all the pictures I have were lost in the fire. I have maybe 3 or 4 pictures. I have no pictures of me and my grandmother. That's the only picture that I have. And the other lady to the right there is my Aunt Pat, who's much like a mother to me as well. She was on the exfiltration team to help get us out of Indiana into California. And to the right there, my better half, Colleen, who's sitting here on the right corner, keeps me on the straight and narrow. But as Dr. King says, there can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. These things, whether it be about forgiveness, compassion, humility, hope, love, it sounds like really softy things, but those are the exact things that I believe has helped me move through my career, whether professionally and in my own personal life, that I offer up to people all the time to use and gravitate to. When we often think about Dr. King, often people think of it as a black-white thing. It's so much for everything that he talked about, everything that he taught, everything that he preached was for all of humankind. And I always, tell people all the time, I've given this talk, this is probably the 5th time over the last 4 years, is that everybody you should embrace. It doesn't matter, what your race or creed or anything of that nature, but he said these things and he did these things on the benefit of all humankind. It wasn't just a black and white thing. But again, I've had all of these things have just given me just a real reflection on, I wanted to give you a real reflection of my life and how these threats that were out there, these attributes and these principles are the things that really did help me get through to where I am today. And I've had a phenomenal, exciting career, and I look forward to continuing with that. So I asked folks at the end, a lot of this is about character and the content of your character. And the ultimate measure of the man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And I always ask people, when you look inside yourself, what's the content of your character? that concludes my talk. Those are the photo credits. That's how you can reach me if you want to just drop me a note or anything. And again, I want to thank you guys for coming out and having a listen to my dialogue. And if you want to talk about some NASA stuff, feel free. I think the mic is open for that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jerry. So if you all have some questions for Jerry, I'm not going to put any limits on it. He can answer any question. Please feel free. So come up to the mic right here, sir, so everybody can hear.
Get that water.
And you can.
I didn't know I was going to be front and center here like you, but thank you very much for your inspiring autobiography.
Sure.
And connecting it with Dr. King.
Sure.
My question is about training within your life. You said you went to a community college and then from there into the Marines,
Yeah.
and then from there into the CIA and then
Yeah.
NASA.
Mm-hmm.
So did you get a degree or a certificate before you went into the Marines? And,
Great.
and can you please touch on
Great.
how the various training available in each one of these steps within your life contributed? And
Sure.
thank you.
Absolutely. So I was in community college for quite a while. I eventually got an undergraduate degree in business with a focus on IT security, and later got a master's degree in network security from a school. It's just their program is a National Security Agency Center of Excellence School in Maryland. And when I was at CIA, or prior to CIA in the Marine Corps, all the training that I got, particularly around counterintelligence, all right, is some of the early stages of getting into the security field. Now, cybersecurity isn't the only thing that I do. I've worked physical security. I'm a graduate from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia. I've taken, weapons, a lot of weapons training, what we call gates, guards, alarms, and that sort of thing. So I've learned a lot about physical security. I went to physical security school down there. I spent time as a private investigator. So in between the time while I was in the reserves before CIA hired me, I was a private investigator, and I got into that job from learning what I learned in the Marine Corps. So I worked for a private investigation company doing skip tracing, people who skip out and disappear, finding hidden assets and things like that, and doing a lot of what they call SIU, Special Investigations Unit. So I did a lot of investigations around insurance scams, insurance fraud, and that sort of thing for that company. And again, parlayed that plus the work I did in the Marine Corps, it came in very helpful at CIA, and finished up my degrees at that time. It took me 8 years to get my undergrad degree. 8 years. I could have been a doctor by the time I finished getting my undergrad. My master's degree took me a little short. I got my master's degree in about 11 months or something like that. So yeah, I sped through that. I just said I wanted to get it done. I got done in about 11 months. So yeah, that's how I went. And I'm one of these people. I'm a continuous learner. I'm always learning stuff. My coffee table's full of books. I'm always picking up things. I'm always reading. I read a lot of leadership books, and I read a lot of functional kind of, around security and things like that. I'm always trying to keep up with my skill set. I'm always doing something. I'm actually taking a class online next month, with MIT on artificial intelligence and machine learning in a manufacturing environment. Just something I wanted to learn, something new. So, great question.
You're here at NASA now?
I was. I departed NASA in 2018, in July 2018. I took what's called a deferred retirement. I have enough time in years combined with my military time, but I'm not old enough to retire. I don't look like it, but I do have two girls that are 30 and 31 years old. Yeah, I look great, don't I? It's hard to maintain this. Yeah. Yeah. A little bit of a conflict there. I know somebody's got something.
Don't be shy. Mr. Davis. First of all, thank you so much for the stories. It's really moving. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
As you look around, you see a lot of young folks here, who are, looking up to you as a role model, your stories and your career achievements. What's the message you would send out to them, especially coming out of adversity, coming out of struggles, and not having the resources to pretty much being set up for success? What's the message you send out to those people?
Yeah, there's a term that I use when I talk to the younger folks, and I call it the persistent pursuit of passion. Right, that you have to have this persistent pursuit about your passion, and if you have that persistent pursuit, you'll get to where you want to go. I guarantee it. You'll get to where you want to go. I didn't always have computer resources or things of that nature. Remember when I was a kid, there was no internet. If you can believe that, some of the younger ones are probably like, "What is he saying? What kind of nonsense is that?" There was no internet, and when I've gone to other disadvantaged communities. One of the things I did when I was at NASA was I would go to disadvantaged communities and talk to the kids at the different schools. I went to South Chicago to environments where kids would never see someone from NASA or never hear about that, and they didn't have any access to resources. But I'm like, you don't have to have a tablet or a PC or a phone. I'm like, you got the library, right? I grew up going to the library. And I would tell them, like, go to the library, latch on to find yourself a mentor, someone that you really admire, and hold on to their leg and make them mentor you. And that's one of the things that I did as well, is that when I found folks that I really admired and I feel like they could mentor me, I never asked them to mentor me. I just made them do it. I just followed them around. I'd ask them questions about everything. I'd hold onto their legs and why they dragged me around. And that's what I did. I co-opted people all the time from a mentorship perspective. But if the resources aren't there that, electronically or digitally, there are other resources. There are tons of things that we do, but just about every kid today, every school has some electronic resource. Dig in, be a self-learner. When I talk about the pursuit of passion, a lot of times people talk about motivation. And they always say like, my motivation. I don't have the motivation. And one of the things I learned, particularly in the Marine Corps, motivation has nothing to do with it. Motivation is actually, I kind of look at it as a bad word. It's really the discipline part of it, right? You can not be motivated, and that really shouldn't mean anything. But if you have the discipline about doing things and pursuing those passions, I guarantee you'll get to where you want to go. Guarantee it. A kid, South Bend, Indiana, West Side, projects, rough environment, house burned down. Just about every one of my uncles died violently. I guarantee you that if you have that dream, you have that passion, and you're persistent about it, you get anywhere you want. You can get anywhere you want. Except for an astronaut like me. But I still work in the community.
Jerry, thank
Yes,
you
ma'am.
very much. That was really very impressive and extremely inspiring. When we look at the whole nature versus nurture debate, while you said something that was very humble when you said about your siblings and perhaps your cousin too, that they have chosen their own paths that are, they've carved out success based on how they see it.
Sure.
What would interest me is, given the environment that you did grow up in and your grandmother being such a force of nature, how did your siblings and your cousin, I don't need to know details, but in terms of their own approach to life and a sense of hopefulness, do they share that with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And more so through role modeling. You see it through their actions more than anything. My oldest brother, Michael, has a PhD in divinity. My younger brother, or middle brother, Dwayne, he spent most of his career in logistics, but they're both pastors. They've both spent a tremendous amount of time working with people. And it's interesting, my mother does a lot of the same thing. She's a pastor as well. a quick story, when we were living in that park and we had nothing to our names, we came across another family that was homeless. My mom ended up helping that family. You know, when we would get food, my mom would take it over to this other family. And when we left that park, we ended up bringing that family with us and helping them. My brothers, both of my brothers, will give you the shirt off their back in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat, they'll give you the shirt off the back. Just phenomenal individuals. And I often turn to my oldest brother when I have questions about things or whatever. And he's written some books on emotional intelligence, and he does a lot of counseling. And so we have discussions about things like that. But that's their lives are about really helping people one-on-one. The funny thing is this story, as many times told, they've never heard it. They've lived it, they've never heard me tell it. And they've said, oh, you're going to speak? I'm like, yeah, I don't know. What are you going to talk about? We lived in the park and that sort of thing. They're like, oh, okay, you know. But they've never heard the story. But, you know, I always say, well, because they lived it as well, but they've never heard it. But my entire family, our lives has always been around helping others. That's been my upbringing. It was always helping someone else, and that's what they do.
Not so much a well thought out question, but the topic of resilience comes to mind, and I'm wondering if you could touch on your advice for building up
resilient systems,
instilling resilience in people because of the ups and downs that life throws at us.
Oh, you're saying in people?
Resilience in people.
Yeah, that's a term we use a lot in cybersecurity, is resilient systems. So,
like, for example, life is not a straight line.
Yeah.
It's a bell curve with a sweet spot in the middle, but it also has flat tires along the way, or fires, or God forbid, that sort of thing.
Yeah. You know, I don't really know if I could teach someone. I can only share my experiences, right? Like when I came here today, and as I said earlier, my real passion is about people, and I try to reach people by telling them these stories. And again, and I've done it through, I've mentored people from, you know, really young kids all the way up through adults that were much older than me. And one of the things I always talk about, if you talk about resilience, is about how they intake things, how you intake things. Remember, you know, there's that saying that says, you know, it's less about what someone says or does to you, it's more about how you react to it. I spend a lot of time kind of, for lack of a better term, preaching that when I'm engaging with folks. But I tell folks all the time, you know, and Colleen hears it from me, I always say, you know, don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. You know, my attitude is if you're not bleeding or dying, it's probably not that big of a deal, you know. And again, it goes back to that attitude around getting beyond hope and having that passion. Even when the chips are down, it just seems like an impossibility. You just got to you got to find it within yourself to keep driving forward. And I really don't know, other than, you know, the picking up personality traits from my grandmother's or things that she told us directly, I kind of don't know where it came from within me. And my brothers, they're the same way. They just keep driving forward. We just keep driving forward. Even when it seemed like there was no hope, you know. But in my head, I just always knew that this wasn't how things were always going to be, right? It's just going to be, maybe it's for a time. It may be for a couple months, maybe for a couple of years, but it's not going to be like this all the time. When I look back in my life, I go, wow, that was crazy. That was really crazy. The bad things, and then the crazy good things that came out of that. There's not a lot of people that get to, with the sort of folks here that worked at NASA with me and Deb, that get to talk about your friends, the astronaut, right? Sitting around with astronauts and, Leland Melvin, an astronaut had multiple flights. So it's these things I look back on, and I try to tell people, that all came about from the passion that I had. I wanted to work in the intelligence community. I worked in the intelligence community. I wanted to work at NASA. I wanted to be an astronaut. They said, no, but you can come work for us anyway. He brought me back twice. And so it's just about that passion helps, I think, build that resiliency, right? You got to have that passion, that kind of fire inside of you, and just keep stoking the flames, just keep stoking the flames. It's not easy. I tell folks that too. I go, it's not easy. But if it's what you really want, you got to keep charging for it all the time.
Hi, I came in late, but I was able to hear some of what you were speaking. And what struck me was what you said about passion. Now, years ago, say in the late 70s, when the leaders of NASA had that passion because they had a particular vision, right? They wanted to launch a space program. They were always looking forward. Now, what is the vision looking forward? Because it seems like even in politics, we're looking backward, make America great again. Rather than looking to the future, we look to the past. What do you think our vision should be for the future?
Are you saying for NASA?
That's a general question. You can answer it. Yeah, because I've also seen NASA go through its budget cuts, and where before you had engineers who were willing to take positions at NASA at less than the industry average, simply because they were motivated by vision, by passion, like you say. But I'm not sure if those incentives are there now.
Yeah. I'm not a spokesperson for NASA, but in my own opinions around that is that I think there is a lot of passion at NASA. I spent nearly 10 years there, and there's a tremendous. You go on any NASA campus, and you'll see a lot of passion. I think some of the things that has happened that it appears that it's been dulled a little bit is that the challenges around politics. There's a lot of politics that happen at places like NASA, and they're at the whim at times of the political natures of administrations and things of that nature. That happens to all federal government agencies, and I think we're kind of seeing that nationally. We're at the whim of politics, and it just depends on which administration and administration's goals and that sort of thing, on how that passion looks, how it's stoked, how those flames are stoked, or if the passion looks like it's dying out. I know individually, you go to each NASA center, and there is a tremendous amount of people that are highly skilled engineers, highly skilled researchers, highly skilled scientists that are working for a tenth of what they could be making in the rest of the world, and they do it because of passion. They do it. They know they're not going to get rich working at NASA, but they love. I think they do it because one, they love NASA. They love it, and they love the country. And it's their passion to work in there. Most people that worked at NASA when I was particularly at Ames, that's the only place they had ever worked in their entire lives. They had no concept of anything else. Deb Fang, only place yeah, So I would say there's a kind of an outward perception about passion and what it may look like outwardly, but internally, I think there's a lot of passion there. And some people may say, hey, NASA's not on track, or the country's not on track. One thing, from a guy who was in the Marine Corps and ran across the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, we're such a resilient country. We're a very resilient country. And if I didn't have bad knees and a bad neck and a bunch of other things wrong with me, if they asked me to go back and run across the desert of Saudi Arabia again, I'd do it. I'd do it in a heartbeat. I hope they don't ask me though. But I can't say much more about that. It's just there's perceptions around it, and I think you have to kind of be internally to really understand that ecosystem of NASA and politics and that sort of thing. They're very, very difficult things to understand. I probably didn't answer your question, but it's a tough one to answer. It's a good question. It's a tough one to answer. Should ask Jim Bridenstine, the administrator of NASA. So. Really, Jonathan?
Hey, Jerry. So you talked about motivation's a bad word, and you said discipline is what kind of got you to where you are today. What are some of the discipline practices that you practiced from a young age to where you are now and still continue to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me is as I said earlier, is learning. Right, I'm always like, so Jonathan is one of the guys I started mentoring years ago. He's a NASA civil servant, but he started off there as an intern, and for a while he was an unpaid intern, and he just kept coming back. He had a lot of passion, kept coming back, no pay, and I've been working with him for a few years now. But as I said earlier, one of the things that I think you could really look at is what I said about education, right? And when we sit down, I talk about that all the time. You always want to be educated. Ever since I was a kid, I was a voracious reader. Both my brothers, we all read all the time. My mom's a big reader. I was that weird kid that read the dictionary and encyclopedias. I still do. I'm not an attorney by any stretch of the imagination, but I love reading Black's Law Dictionary, which Colleen bought me for, was it my birthday? Yeah, she bought me a big, thick book because I'm a weirdo and I just like reading and learning things. But I think the big thing is like you'll see me consistently disciplined about learning and always being a continuous student. Always, you'll always see me reading something, picking up something, learning something new, getting into areas of things that I know nothing about and doing fairly well with it in just a matter of months. My last job after I left NASA was in a semiconductor environment. Never worked in semiconductors my entire career. Didn't ever think I'd work in semiconductors. But when I got into it, jumped into it at 100 miles an hour and read everything I could about it and got, I think, pretty proficient about it in a short order of time, about 6 months. Still a lot I don't know about it, but it's that education piece. That would be the one thing I tell folks is like stay up on education and learning about things.
Sorry for coming late.
That's okay.
I make as fast as possible.
There is a quiz in a little bit.
So I read those lovely quotes you had from Dr. King, and he was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. So and he was he was a follower of non-cooperation and non-violence. Mm-hmm. And many of Dr. King's, the things that he engaged in, right, was of non-cooperation, non-violence, right? Right. So in this world where we are seeing increasing hatred and violence, you talked about hope. So how do you think that we should think about keeping hope that ultimately humanity would survive in this world of hatred and violence?
It's I think you said it. You have to have hope. I did this talk when I did this talk the second time at Ames. I think it was 2018 or 2017. I can't remember. One of his quotes that I had some different ones, but one of the quotes that I had at that time, it talked about. It's his quote where he talks about. Why we hate each other, and he says because we fear one another, and we fear each other because we don't talk to each other. And I see a lot of that taking place. Is that there's no communication. People are too impatient to have the crucial conversations and to understand the other person sitting across the table. I think compassion is much more than just for the homeless person or things like that. It's compassion really about when you're at odds and opposition with people, but about having compassion for that person across the table and really sitting down and listening. That's the one thing that I don't think people do very well is listen. Listening is a skill. Yeah. It's a skill. And I don't think people listen. People are too tied up into their own thought process and what they want to say, and they want to get their point across, that they don't listen. And I mean from a micro level to the macro level.
Yep.
And I think to be able to stoke the fires of hope is that it takes individuals, right, to make that happen. It's not going to just happen at the with the president or with someone in administration. It's individuals have to be willing to have the conversations and communicate with people that are unlike them. I think when you really look at individuals deep down inside each other, we all want the same things. We really do. We all really want the same things. When I was in Washington, D.C. for 20 years and in some of the highest levels of government and going to Congress and that sort of thing, and you had one political party and this political party, at some level, you really all wanted the same things. Yeah. You just took different paths to get there, and maybe not always communicated in the right way. But people, I think, at the national level, when you down to cities and counties and towns, people want the same things, but you have to have the conversation. A lot of times we just don't have the conversation, and when we do have the conversation, no one's really listening. So you gotta kind of force it. You gotta just keep getting out there and talking and not to throw a cliche out there, but I'm a big believer of not judging the book by its cover. Right. I get that a lot. People see like, oh, I was at NASA, and they think I came from. They think I went to Princeton and that sort of thing, and then they find out that like, oh no, I'm from the ghetto in South Bend, Indiana, and that sort of thing. But again, I think those are the key attribute is about communication. It's about listening. It's about having compassion for the other person and trying to understand where people are trying to go.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for serving our country.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely.
And, So it appears that a large portion of your career has been as a public servant. Yeah. And I was wondering if there was something from your childhood or within your sphere of influence that you felt it was important to be a pretty much lifelong public servant and what that really has meant to you.
Yeah. It's funny. It wasn't a desire of mine until I got in it and really understood what it meant to be a public servant. I went into the Marine Corps not because I was patriotic, because I didn't want to be hungry anymore, right? And I wanted to have another skill set. I wanted to have some skills. But once I got in it, whether it was the Marine Corps and then on my way to the public service, I was really passionate about it, right? I worked at the Department of Education. NASA is the most recognizable brand in the world. And, somewhere like the Department of Education isn't, right? People go like, what did you, and I was the director for information assurance or cybersecurity, basically information protection there. People would say like, well, what do? You protect SAT scores or what do you do there? But I had a big passion for their mission. And their mission was about, putting, the constituency through higher education, through loans and policies and that sort of thing. And so I got behind that mission and got passionate about that mission. And then I worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs, the largest agency in the federal government, 400,000 people, 20 million veterans every year. And I was passionate about that because I had been a veteran. And I wanted to continue to serve because I know what veterans go through. And I know some of the frustrations that they had with Veterans Affairs, and I wanted to help that and support that. My kids, as they were growing up and trying to figure out what they wanted to do in their lives, I said, public service. I said, there's no greater thing than serving. There's something about, I think, for me, why I did it for long, because it fulfilled me in some kind of way. It made me feel good about that I was serving, doing something bigger than myself. Doing something great. It wasn't about me. It was about the people. It was at NASA. It was about, the astronauts and the scientists and the engineers and doing things that were going to benefit all of mankind, right? I had some little piece of that. The Department of Education is about the students, and Veterans Affairs is about the veterans. It was always just something. I just wanted to do something bigger than myself. And so that was kind of, the hook for me. It wasn't always that. It was something I looked at and said, I want to be this lifelong, civil servant or public servant. Once I got in it, I loved it. I really loved it. Like anywhere else, like any other job, there's a lot of frustrations. There's a lot of times where you're like, this place can kick rocks. I want to go do something. Even at NASA, I was like, this place can kick rocks. It's very politicized and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, I really love what I did, and I love what I did on behalf of the mission. And anywhere else I've worked outside of NASA, when I was consulting and as I do now, I'm all about the mission of the business of where I am and what they do. And if it's a publicly traded company, I'm all about the shareholders and investors and things like that, and making sure we're doing the right things on their behalf. It's something that comes from the inside, right? And some of those attributes I talked about, it comes from the inside. Again, I can't always put my finger on it. It's just who I am, right? I'm just wired that way. It's just that DNA strand that I have.
You've worked for a couple decades in security, cybersecurity, information security, and you live in our society, and you've got a computer at home and a cell phone. Yeah. Could you touch on what you do to be a smart and safe person in our world, so that your phone doesn't get hacked and like Bezos in the news today, or your family, that sort of thing, your pictures or what?
Yeah, it's tough because technology is evolving so fast, right? And the world is very different than it was even 5 years ago. So different, and the threats that are out there are constantly evolving. Constantly, and you're always trying to stay on top of things. The hard part of it in protecting myself is trying to just keep up with everything that's going on, right? So I try to focus on a couple of really simple things. If we're talking about your online presence, what I'm starting to find out, I've learned over the last couple of years is that me personally, I have to kind of dumb down my online presence, right? Because people now, they get online, they find out who you are, and they start to use that against you to impersonate other people and that sort of thing. So I have to start stripping some things offline. I have a lot of content online. I've got videos and stuff. I'm doing a lot of different things, but things like LinkedIn and that sort of stuff, it's a treasure trove of information, and people use that to attack you by coming through or coming in like through LinkedIn as a LinkedIn request, and they'll use that and find out who you're connected to and try to do different things. So one thing is kind of doling down that online presence. I think the other thing is when you're just talking about just basic security, whether it's a phone or a laptop, a desktop, it's like keeping them updated, right? What we call basic hygiene. Keeping them updated, patching, things like antivirus, really, really simple things, what we call blocking and tackling. Basic blocking and tackling, which we also find in the security community is most people don't do that. A lot of times you hear out in the world like, oh, these sophisticated attacks are going on and they're doing this and they're able to get in that. A lot of times when you really raise the hood and you look at what's really happened, it's really not that sophisticated, because we've done a lot of things. We've locked all the front doors, but we left all the back doors open. Really simple things, and people just come in right through the back doors. So I try to do really basic hygiene. When I get emails in, I don't click on every link. Like everybody wants to click on links right away. I make sure I don't just click on a link that could be fraudulent and loaded up with malware to let somebody onto my system. I'm very suspicious about that. I'm suspicious about getting phone calls now from individuals that I've never heard of before. I'm very suspicious about emails from individuals that address me as, hey, Jerry, blah, 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 blah. Hey, here's a link, come here. So I'm like, I don't think so. So it's the level of awareness. I try to have a heightened level of awareness. And I always tell folks, even when I was in physical security, right, and worked a level of executive level protection in my time at CIA, we always tell people, and especially when they're traveling, like if something doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. People have senses, and you'll notice things, but people a lot of times don't listen to their senses. So even like digitally, if something doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. The person on the other end of the phone probably isn't a prince in Kenya that's got money locked up and he needs $1,000 from you to unlock this thing. But that's one thing I told my mom not too long ago. My mom called me probably 2 months ago, and it was back in October, and she says, "Hey, I'm on the phone with this guy, and he says that someone's hacked my computer, and he needs me to give him information so he can go and clean up." He said he's from Microsoft. And she says, "I told him to hold on because my son knows about this and something sounds right." I said, "Mom, hang up." I go, "Did you give him any information?" She goes, "No, I was going to," but she goes, "But it just seems so weird." So I told him, I said, "Is he still on the line?" She said, "Yeah." I go, "Hang up on him. Hang up." And she said it was from the bank. He said he was also, he wanted to check to make sure no one had gotten into her bank account, so he needed her banking information. She goes, "Yeah." I said, "Mom, no one needs your banking information." I said, "And the bank isn't going to call you and do it that way." So she did. So it was one of those things where she started to have the dialogue, but then she realized this doesn't sound right. Something's not right about this. I always tell folks that follow that very basic instinct. If it doesn't look right, probably something what I like to say is technical terms, probably something funky with it. Yeah, red flags, yeah. But basic hygiene, keeping things up to date. Be careful about downloading apps, even apps in the App Store. A lot of them, they get verified or validated, but still they get through, and they're packed with malware. They're packed with things that steal your credentials and identities and that sort of thing. To be real careful about going out and I always tell folks, only download apps that you need or that you want. Don't just randomly go out there. Someone's like, "Oh, here's just a cool app," and you want to see how cool it is, and you just go download it. People do that a lot. I'm going to say, if it's only for a specific purpose that you need it, go and grab it. Make sure it's from a reputable, organization, and then use it. Don't just download, a bunch of. You'll be amazed at if you're able to, look at your operating system on your phone. If you have a lot of apps, all the things they're doing and talking and that sort of thing. Probably not a good thing. So I always tell folks to be really careful about the apps that they download. Yeah. So it's really just really basic, what I like to say, common sense, But as my boss when I was at CIA, she used to say common sense is rarer than money. But she said common sense is rarer than money. So I always tell people, a lot of it really is just really common sense and trust that gut instinct. I mean, that's the way it's going, right? Cloud services, everything's moving out to the cloud. You have to have some level of trust in your cloud provider, that they're doing the right things on their side. I do both. I back up on a cloud and I back up on hard media. Because I believe in the redundancy, which is another military-ism I give you. This is what we always say in the Marine Corps, that from a redundancy perspective is that 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So I always like to have 2 of everything, I sent my presentation in this morning so they can get it loaded up and everything. But one of the first things I did when I, on my way here was I loaded up, and it's kind of in my pocket somewhere, is thumb drive with the presentation as well. Like I was guaranteed something's probably going to go wrong, So I like the 2 is 1, 1 is not. So I'll back up things to the cloud, but I also have it on hard media as well. Just I'm a little paranoid that way. You're going to ask me something really hard, aren't you?
Yeah. So at your time at cybersecurity, have you ever faced any attacks?
Absolutely. I think it's easier to tell you when we didn't face attacks. It was all day, every day. Particularly at NASA, we have what we call the Global Security Operations Center, and it's out at Ames, and it's a pretty cool environment. I was responsible for help standing it up when I was running cybersecurity for NASA in 2007. 2008, we started building this environment, and it can see all of NASA, all the networks, all the computers, all the way out to the Russia site. And we would see tons and tons of attacks taking place on a daily basis, so all the time.
Another question I have is, back then at your early jobs, right? How were you treated? Like, at the CIA, you said they had really big suspicions about you, right? Because of your
There's
race.
suspicions of everybody.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But yeah, how did they treat you at that workplace?
Great. I loved it. I loved working at CIA. It was one of my most favorite jobs that I ever had. Remember, I was a really young guy, older than you, but a lot younger than I am now. And I went all over the world. Got to see a lot of interesting things and meet a lot of interesting people, all on the government's dollar. So it was pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you for your speaking today. It's very a lot of passion that I can feel.
Sure.
So I have a question. If it back in time, if you can choose another career, what career that you want to choose?
It's
Education.
easy. HR. Yeah. I think I've told them that, because I love people. I love interacting with people. I love talking to people. I love just having that dialogue with people. So I always said that if I was going to do anything else outside of security, I'd be in human resources. And when I tell that to human resources people, they look at me like I got two heads. They're like, why would you want to? I'm like, I just think it's kind of cool. Like, you sit down with people, you get to, walk through issues and talk to things. I said, I would be in HR. Yeah.
We have time for more questions if you don't have any. Oh, yes, this gentleman.
I came in late, but I was wondering why you chose to work for the CIA. Just curious.
It was, that weird kid thing in me where I was fascinated with the intelligence world, right? And I don't remember exactly how I got exposed to it. At some point I did, and that's what I wanted to do. I remember when I lived in Southern California, I was probably 12 years old. And for Christmas, a couple of Christmases earlier, when I was probably like 11, so I was probably about 13 at the time, one of the things I got was a fingerprint kit. My mom got me a fingerprint kit. And I would walk around the house and I would fingerprint everything. I had everybody in the whole house, all their fingerprints. I had these little cards. And for prints on light surfaces, it came with a little jar of graphite. And you put it on there, had a little brush, had feathers, and then you take it had little like pieces of Scotch tape, and you would put that over and it would lift the print out, and then you would put them on these fingerprint cards. And I had the whole family, I had them all lined up at one point, and I was doing each of their fingerprints. And I had this fingerprint kit, and I had a briefcase. And inside the briefcase, I had a walkie-talkie, my fingerprint kit, and rope. and I remember my mom, if I hadn't killed myself, she was going to kill me because I was on the roof of the house, and I was on my spy mission, and I had tied the rope around the chimney, and I'm trying to come down the chimney with the briefcase in my hand, trying to come down the chimney, and my mom could see the rope hanging down in front of the kitchen window. She comes out, and I'm like halfway trying to get down the chimney, and I've got this big briefcase. It was something in me about curiosity and investigations and trying to think what people are doing and that sort of thing that really kind of pushed me. I was a private investigator first, and then got into the counterintelligence field, first through the Marine Corps and then on to CIA from there. But it was just, a lot of it was curiosity. I was just fascinated by spy stuff.
Yeah, for the kids out there, that's not normal. Don't do that. More questions? Oh, good.
As a kid, who was your biggest role model, and why?
That's a good question. I would have to say, because I read a lot, so I was big into Einstein. And I was big into Einstein and Tesla, Nikola Tesla. I used to read everything and it's not just a car factory.
Do you still feel the same way now?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I got a couple other ones as I got older. One of the things that I was a runner. I was in cross country and ran track and everything. You wouldn't know I was 50 pounds lighter, but I'm big into track and field, and so I have a couple of favorites out there. One is a guy named Jim Ryan, and another guy is a guy named Billy Mills that I'm big role model, big fans of.
When you did track, did you do any field events?
I did. I high jumped and I triple jumped. But my main events were, I was a miler and a half miler. And I ran a quarter mile too.
And when you worked at LAM as a chief security officer, what did you do?
At LAM? So at LAM, I was a chief security officer, and I was responsible for all the computer systems, security of the computer systems. I was responsible for what we call physical security, so that was the protection of all our facilities and our employees and things like that all over the world. And then the last piece of it, my responsibility was for what we call business continuity. So if something happened to the company, whether it was the systems or the equipment we used to manufacture our technology there, if it went down, we couldn't get to it, my job was to make sure that we had plans to bring everything back up. And that lady who's sitting over from you, she ran that for me, Tanya. She ran business continuity for me. So I had a pretty big job. It was a lot of stuff.
Do you have any comments on Space Force? Do you think you'll be asked to go back?
You know, I've kind of watched it. Not a lot of comments on it. I think some folks don't quite understand fully, you know, what it is. And I don't think it's fully baked. But I think at the end of the day, when we look at Space Force, it's new in title, but the missions and the roles, the people that fill it are things that are already going on. So what you're probably going to see is folks move from different elements of Air Force in particular, and the other military units moved under Space Force to fill out the ranks and that sort of thing. It won't be a new thing. I think a lot of people think it's actually going to be a Space Force where, you know, we run out, we hop in our spaceship and we fly out in space. Now, I think it really is just taking existing capabilities and people into one new environment. It's yet to see how this plays out in the long run, because anytime you try to break up military environments, you get a lot of fighting going on, because everybody wants to control their own aspect within the military.
Is there any missions for NASA that are going to land people on the Mars?
I think, you know, NASA had a mission several years ago to go to Mars, but before they get to Mars, they have to prove out a lot of the technology first. So one of the things NASA's doing is there's a program called Artemis, and Artemis will take astronauts to the moon first. And the idea is once we get to the moon will become what we call a gateway. And what we'll do is kind of practice doing things on the moon and then use the moon as a step to get from the moon, to use that to get to Mars from there. But there's still a lot of things that they have to overcome to get to Mars. The trip to Mars is going to take 7 or 8 months, roughly. So how do you sustain humans for 7 to 8 months in a little tiny spacecraft going to Mars? The other side of it is there's a lot of radiation out there, and they still haven't quite figured out how to keep astronauts safe from the radiation. So it'll be probably a while before we see anybody go to Mars, but I think we'll see folks in the next few years going to the moon first and doing a lot of work on the moon with the Artemis program. That sound about right, Deb?
Hi, my name is Rushil Jayanth. I just came to this because I'm very interested in cybersecurity and NASA in general. What do you think about the applications of data science in cybersecurity?
The applications of data science? That's a great question. Because of the fact that in cybersecurity, what we're finding, and we started finding it years ago, is that there is a tremendous amount of data inside of the security systems. And I always used to say that inside of all that data, there's a pony in there somewhere. And so when the career path of data science came up, they were working in a lot of other areas, right, to improve efficiencies of systems and processes. In the last probably 8 or 9 years, we've seen a big shift of data scientists working specifically in the cybersecurity area. One of the places that I've seen it happen the most is in the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy, not only do they work around energy matters and nuclear weapons and things like that, is they're also in the United States very, very big on and have a mission around cybersecurity. One of the things they do is they employ a lot of data scientists to tease out things and figure out how they can use things like artificial intelligence within cybersecurity and the data science there that goes along with it to improve what we call resiliency or make better systems. So data science is a growing profession, especially in the cybersecurity arena. And I tell folks all the time, that's one of the things they should be studying, like yourself, like get into the analytics and data sciences, and you do that in cybersecurity, you always have a job, at least for now, until AI takes over the world.
How can I get started on doing those things?
Resources. Get out to the resources. Get out on the web. Go out and read about those things. Join the different groups that are out there. I'm a big YouTube nut, right? And so there's so much you can learn on YouTube. Whenever I hear about something I don't know anything about it, I go right to YouTube. Data science, and there's somebody doing a 30-minute briefing on data science. So I do a lot of self-study, a lot of learning, but use the resources that are out there. The internet is a treasure trove of those types of things, particularly places like YouTube that has a lot of videos and learning environments out there. You can learn things right away. So you just jump right in, find some books and things like that that you may like, buy them and read through them. And I always take a lot of notes too. I do it just like I'm in class. I sit at home and I read things and I take notes. So yeah, a lot of self-actuation, just jump in it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, well that's it. I'm happy to see everybody here at our first series, speaker for the NASA Speaker Series, and I want to thank Jerry for spending time with us. So gracious with your time, Jerry. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
We've had
absolutely.
this in the works for months, right? When did I talk to you? November?
Something like that, yeah.
So I'm really glad he got out here, and so happy that you guys came out. Again, he's the first in our series of about 10 this year, and we're working on just confirming a few more talks so that we can publish the whole program and you can kind of see what's coming. But they are largely once a month, about the middle of the month, not a council week, so that I can be awake and moving. This happens to be a council week. But please look for that soon. I will be pushing that out through all the social media channels, the items of interest, the scene. If you pick that up, it'll be everywhere. All right, thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.